It's estimated that in around 5 to 10 years, India's population will overtake China to become the world's most populous country at 1.4 billion people, or nearly 1 in 6 people on the planet. You could take every single country in the Americas, from Mexico to the United States to Brazil, and add together their populations, and it would still be less than this one country, with India also having more people than all of Africa put together. So it's not too surprising that this region is well known for having one of the largest and most infamous diaspora communities in nearly every corner of the planet. However, before the mass emigration of the past couple decades that has seen tens of millions of South Asians moving to various parts of the earth, both temporarily and permanently, there was actually a global wave of migration very seldom discussed in the Western world or even India itself, despite being far larger and influential than many would assume, even impacting America, Britain, and other countries. This centuries-old community of South Asian descendants around the world is actually tied to the sub-Saharan African slave trade, believe it or not, since, as I've mentioned before, although initially quite heavily involved in the exportation and purchase of slaves, primarily from West Africa, the British had a swift and fierce moral upending sometime in the 19th century, aggressively opposing all forms of slavery, not only within its own empire, but also in territories all around the world, although some have argued over the exact motives for this change of heart. The British decided to go above and beyond in their abolitionist movement for whatever reason, and conducted what became known as the Great Experiment, an attempt by the British to show that indentured servitude and contract labor was not only more ethical, but also cheaper, more efficient, and convenient. And although the British had already been doing this for quite some time with the exportation of the Irish as indentured servants to the Americas, their gains in the Indian subcontinent gave them a new opportunity for a cheap, and I can't stress this enough, abundant labor pool, as even at the beginning of the 19th century, the population of the Indian subcontinent outnumbered that of Great Britain's over 20 to 1. By this point, the British already had colonies and territories set up literally around the globe. Remember, the sun never set on the British Empire, with a diverse array of purposes, with some being used as settler colonies for a growing British population, others being used purely in a mercantile fashion, and others being acquired kind of just because they could, not really having any larger discernible purpose other than keeping them out of the hands of other Europeans. The British weren't the only ones to use Indians as cheap labor, however, as other European colonial powers that had possessions in South Asia also exported Indian contractors to their colonies as well, mostly the French and Dutch, although arguably the Portuguese were some of the first to move Indians around the planet, as there are records of Goanese laborers and priests settling in Portugal, Brazil, or even Africa centuries before the British accelerated this trend. To label all of these early laborers Indians, however, is kind of a misnomer, as they actually came from various parts of South Asia, including what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and there are even examples later on of Indian descendants being moved here and there around the global empire, such as exporting Malaysian Indians to Mauritius or South Africa. The overwhelming majority of these early migrants were used for manual labor positions and were dubbed coolies, deriving from a term for workers in Hindi, although technically speaking, other migrants from Asia, such as those from China or Southeast Asia, were also used in much smaller numbers, and the Europeans, mostly British, exported South Asian laborers to many parts of the world. However, there are four major regions of Indian settlement across the planet, those being the Caribbean, Southeast Africa, the Malaysian Peninsula, and the Pacific. Although even in these four regions, there are unique communities and clusters that have different histories. In Africa, coolies, who were overwhelmingly male, were initially used as laborers in agriculture, predominantly sugarcane plantations owned by local whites. And as to the ethical practices of some of the contract holders, it was undoubtedly less brutal than the chattel slavery used earlier, although sometimes the terms of said contracts were quite strict, with heavy restrictions on where a contract laborer could travel, what they could do, and where they could and couldn't work, not having nearly as much freedom as a private worker, sometimes even being jailed if they refused to work or broke their contract. In British East Africa, however, the Indians who had arrived were actually quite wealthy and influential when compared both to the native African population and European settlers, working as freelance traders, merchants, and owners of plantations or industries, having quite a strong community with its own unique culture. Although conversely, on the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean, the bulk of the Indian laborers had their own culture and identity stripped away, as they were often forcibly converted to Catholicism since the island was under French rule. Also, one crucial difference between these communities was the ethnic and religious origins of these coolies, as the bulk of laborers that arrived in Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname were of Bihari, specifically Bhojpuri origin, while most who arrived in South Africa, Reunion, Malaysia, Singapore, and the French West Indies were predominantly Tamil, and even Indians from other ethno-linguistic groups that wouldn't have otherwise done so largely assimilated with the dominant Indian people in their region. For instance, Tamils and Telugus learned Hindi on Fiji, while Bengali and Hindustani migrants to Malaysia learned Tamil, something which anyone from India can tell you is quite rare to say the least. Similarly to the Americas, although many intended to return to their homelands once their contracts expired, the majority, around 2/3 actually, found themselves permanently calling these new lands their home, and ended up either marrying local women, or more commonly arranged for their own families or brides to arrive, crafting families in a region that's quite far from their homeland. For the descendants of these migrants of this century-and-a-half-old community, additional European, African, and Chinese ancestry from earlier on in their bloodlines is not uncommon for many South Asian descendants from various regions, and the only region where interracial marriage was actually pretty uncommon was/is the island of Fiji, as although not quite segregated from each other, the vast cultural and religious differences between the Indo-Fijians and Aitake have ensured that intermixing between these two groups is kept to a minimum. In many areas, such as Reunion, an overseas department of France in the Indian Ocean, the bulk of their population is of mixed origins, mixing Indian, Malagasy, and European DNA into a sort of genetic and cultural melting pot. So the exact number of those of coolie ancestry worldwide is difficult to ascertain, and even in South Africa, a large portion of the colored and even white Afrikaner community has some Indian ancestry. Worldwide, I estimate there is a staggeringly high 13 million people that have full or partial ancestry from these old migrants from South Asia who were brought to various parts of the world to work as laborers for various reasons. So not really comparable to the old European diaspora, of whom the vast majority left and settled in different countries on their own accord, or the African diaspora, of whom the vast majority were bought as slaves in Africa and transported without their consent mainly to the Americas and the Middle East. Percentage-wise, this is admittedly not a huge proportion of the South Asian populace, being outnumbered 100-1 when compared to the entire population of India, which is pretty small when put next to the historic diaspora rates of countries like Ireland, Germany, or Italy, with the Republic of Ireland even having 5 to 6 times as many people of Irish descent living outside its borders than in it, or Germany easily having half as many people of German descent living in the United States alone. There are at least 50, maybe even closer to 100,000 Indo-Caribbeans scattered throughout Latin America, mostly in places near to the West Indies, such as in Panama, Venezuela, or Colombia, and they have assimilated with various degrees of success, and I would estimate that there are around 1.2 million descendants of these old-time Indian laborers that now reside in various parts of the Western world, overwhelmingly in Anglosphere countries such as the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and these Indian descendants are from a wide assortment of countries, with there being a particularly large Indo-Caribbean population from Guyana and Trinidad in North America, a large number of Indo-Fijians in Australia and New Zealand, and the bulk of Indians settled in parts of East Africa have migrated to the UK in the past half-century. These groups have had various levels of integration with the dominant cultures of their new countries, either forming their own communities, intermarrying with the white population, or the newer Indian communities directly migrating from South Asia. But the bulk still see themselves as distinct and may or may not take offense to the label Indian, seeing as to how some of their ancestors may have left India even before the ancestors of some white Americans left Europe. Smaller numbers also exist in the Netherlands, predominantly of Indo-Surinamese extraction, with some even estimating that the number of Indo-Surinamese in the Netherlands is actually higher than the number that actually remained in the country of Suriname in South America itself. And there is even a community in France descended from migrants from the Mascarene Islands and the French West Indies, far outnumbering the Indian population from South Asia itself. The familial and cultural connections between these in the Indian diaspora and their home country can vary considerably, as some have literally zero links with their homeland whatsoever, with their ancestors having migrated many generations ago and completely assimilated into their new countries, which is why a lot of Indo-Mauritians or Indo-Trinidadians might be quite confused if they were called an Indian, seeing as to how an American would be quite perplexed to be called British, though yes, a lot of this does have to do with the vernacular. In many of these countries around the world, including the Mascarene Islands, Fiji, Malaysia, Singapore, and most of the English-speaking Caribbean islands, there is a national holiday celebrating the arrival of these indentured laborers, often coined as Indian Arrival Day, commemorating the first coolies to be brought to these strange and exotic lands by the Europeans. And even in India, there is a holiday celebrating the old Indian diaspora, their contributions in terms of history, culture, economics, and politics to many different countries around the world, and to India itself. The South Asian population of the United States has literally doubled in the past decade, from 3 million in 2010 to nearly 6 million today, making them one of the larger racial minorities in many cities around the country. And although smaller numbers exist in Canada, the 2 million Indians and Indo-Canadians to the north are a large and growing population of the country, especially in major cities such as Toronto and Vancouver. Although these more recent immigrants may be far more visible in American media and entertainment, it's important not to discount the other older migrants that are a product of an entirely different era, oftentimes with wildly different cultures and identities from their cousins back in the Indian subcontinent. So please, go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the old South Asian diaspora around the world. And for today's poll, let me know which one of these groups is of the most interest to you. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.